We've had a bunch of different topics, and as we looked towards March and we thought, what do we want to talk about or what do we need to talk about in March? We thought, I think we need to talk about racism again. And specifically, we need to talk about the intersection of racism and the pandemic. Kim, I'm going to invite you to have any opening remarks that you'd like to. Thank you for coming.
So it is an honor to be asked to share some time with you online and on this topic. I was born in Toronto and I live in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, as well as Métis and many other nations and Inuit people since then. I'm a treaty person under Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty. My ancestors came from Japan in 1900, and they farmed and they fished on the traditional territories of the Comox First Nations territories and unceded territories of the Esquimalt, Saanich, and Songhees nations. We know this land now by the colonized name Vancouver Island. An Indigenous elder once told me that his community of Bella Bella knew Japanese Canadian fisher folk, which my grandfather was, to have built the best fishing boats that they knew of. And Indigenous peoples also built fishing boats, but they admired the Japanese Canadians for their abilities. And this friend also grew up with Japanese soy sauce. So there was trading that happened along the West Coast. So my fishing ancestors, the story has been told to me, were in harmonious relationship with First Nations on the lower West Coast until World War II. And so I locate myself because the personal is political. So I am a fourth generation Japanese Canadian. And I say Japanese Canadian because in some ways it's a code phrase, which means by the 1940s, my Canadian ancestors, my Canadian family, my Canadian community in BC were called enemy aliens and yellow peril at the start of the Second World War. And at that time, their possessions, homes, businesses were confiscated and sold by the BC government to pay for their own incarceration in their own country. And to this day, I don't wear yellow. When the war ended, BC was able to get the federal government to not allow Japanese Canadians to return to their homes on the West Coast. That was sold anyways, but still, they couldn't return. Canada apologized in 1988, an auspicious date for those of us who are Japanese Canadian for several reasons. We were also awarded financial redress to every living survivor, so that included my parents. But BC has still not apologized for its active role in the systemic and economic racism against Japanese Canadians, still, because Japanese Canadians are still forever foreigners. Go back where you came from. I've heard many times in my life, as many other Asians have. Not one Japanese Canadian was arrested or charged, let alone convicted of any crime against Canada. There are Japanese Anglican and United Churches who were in existence in the 1940s, and the United Church, for one, had the ear of the government in those days. So did the churches protest as vehemently against this injustice of its own people as it did, say, draft dodgers? Not so much. So it's important for me to name where my ancestors settled in Canada and when, because a conversation today about anti-Asian racism is personal and political. It's individual and communal. It's past and present. It's Canadian and global. It's unifying and divisive. During the Second World War, Chinese residents in BC, people who had built the railroads at a cost to a great many lives and had endured the head tax and Exclusion Act and the 1907 riots in Vancouver, took to wearing signs that said "not Japanese" for self-preservation and protection, because to be mistaken for Japanese meant internment, incarceration, and stigma. And it was a political beginning of inter-Asian racial division. When the war ended, BC negotiated with the federal government to make sure that Japanese Canadians moved east of the Rockies and were forced to be refugees in their own country, which would now be against the Geneva Code Convention. They were not allowed to move just anywhere they felt like it. They had to go where they were accepted. So Toronto had an off-the-books rule that did not allow resettlement after the war ended. Trains from the West would not allow Japanese Canadians to disembark in Toronto. And a Japanese Canadian community group is now bringing this attention to the city of Toronto and showing correspondence that some of their family had kept to prove, even though the rules aren't on the books, it was an informal rule. So racism and dehumanization of people always rise in times of global and domestic economic greed and crisis. People from African countries were dehumanized and enslaved for profit in the Americas, including Canada. Chinese men were dehumanized, exploited, and put on the dangerous front lines of lighting the dynamite that built the Canadian Railroad. And then were not allowed to bring wives or families to Canada. Black men had few job opportunities, even if they were highly educated, and relegated to jobs as to have their own sleeping quarters for their 72-hour shifts. And they were called Boy or George, regardless of their real names. Man camps along pipeline construction sites continue to ensnare Indigenous women. Anti-Asian racism is less well known in the Canadian anti-racism narrative. There was violence and harassment during the SARS virus in 2003, not so long ago. And now during the COVID-19 pandemic, anti-Asian hate crimes have risen in Vancouver 717%. Canada, a city where Asian Canadian-owned businesses have thrived, economics is the underlying threat. If you saw the romantic comedy Crazy Rich Asians, which I actually loved, Vancouver were regularly spray painted with racist graffiti. Threats to white economic profit and gain are often acted out as racist hate. So is it a surprise that the China virus, the Chinese virus labels triggered already present anti-Asian racist attitudes and hate crimes? My first reaction when I first heard that the coronavirus was said to originate in China was dread and premonition. My first reaction was, oh no, the racist targeting begins. And then it did. Early last year, before the lockdown began in March, and after the coronavirus had been identified in North America, my partner, who is Korean, and I spent a reading week at a hotel where I have a family connection. We were waiting for the down elevator at almost the top floor, and along with us was a South Asian family from the same floor. And the elevator door opened and there was a couple in there, a white couple, and they took one look at us and ran out of the elevator, clearly wanting to take another elevator that we were not on. So we were startled and we actually laughed at the transparency of this microaggression at the time. It was actually a precursor to more blatant aggressions that I was to experience in grocery stores in the months to follow and continue to do so. So thanks to the repeated taunts by the former US president, the Chinese virus backlash quickly turned from name calling to hate incidents to targeted hate violence crimes. Elderly Asians and Asian women especially have been shoved, slashed, burned with acid, and beaten by random strangers. At least one person has died in Canada from their injuries. And yet still the Western world cannot connect the dots about racism as easily as they can for anti-Black racism and violence, or anti-Indigenous even. The pandemic has been weaponized against Asians. Even video recordings of assaults are not systemic proof enough. Since most Asians do not report these crimes, the Asian Canadian arm called Act to End Racism was forced to document as many incidents as possible and encourage their victims to report their crimes, because many victims don't. For one thing, they don't want to create a fuss, they don't want to draw attention to themselves, and they also don't believe that the crimes are really racially motivated. Neither does Canadian society or American society. But from the day that he was elected, President Biden publicly believed them. And yesterday, which was an exciting day actually, condemned the violence the Asian community suffered as Americans. And he said they are Americans. The Canadian narrative that we invented of ourselves has always been that we are not like Americans. We're not like them. Targeted violent racism doesn't happen here. Canada welcomes everyone in this multicultural mosaic. Canada is the North Star, the destination of freedom for the Underground Railroad. That narrative needs a wake-up call. Canada is the birthplace of Proud Boys. The KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is alive and well in Alberta and Ontario. The province of British Columbia still denies it has a racist past. Indigenous women and girls are still going missing and murdered. And government promises are not put into legislated action. Law enforcement and legal systems still have too many bad apples. Senator Murray Sinclair, former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has said that language is one of the pillars of racism, and language wears many faces. Unlike Canada, the US does not have an official language. Last week, the Golden Globe Awards named the Korean American film Minari as the best foreign language film. Not the best film, because they didn't have more than 50% of English in their film. Yet it was an American film through and through about a Korean-speaking immigrant family in an American city, filmed in the US, produced and directed by Americans. So East Asians have fallen under the category called Oriental, and that was a Eurocentric name that was actually named as a derogatory term until 1968, when Chinese Americans were influenced by the Black Panther movement and wanted to name themselves in a way that represented a collective embrace of different Asian groups. It was a difficult task because the legacy of inter-Asian colonization and militarization and occupation. Each Asian group in the US, as in Canada, has had a reason why it needed to be distinct from other Asian groups. Most wanted to not be associated with Japanese communities because of the militarization and occupation in their original homelands. The self-identified term Asian American was especially embraced following the 1982 killing of Chinese American Vincent Chin, who was beaten to death because his white killers were angry that the Japanese car manufacturers were too successful. Vincent Chin was not Japanese, and yet he was targeted because he looked Japanese. For their crimes, these killers received probation and small fines of $3,780 each. White privilege at its best. It was also a pivotal moment. Asian Americans realized that they could no longer continue to be divided by their homeland histories of military occupation and aggressions, particularly by the Japanese military. They realized they needed to know each other's North American stories. Only by standing together could minority groups continue to come out from under the weight of oppression together. Because it seems to matter more that white people cannot tell the difference between Asian groups, and that more than that, Asians have distinct identities and conflicting histories. We all look alike. How many times have you heard that? Canadians, including Asian Canadians, have bought into the language of the model minority. It's a myth, and Asian Canadians themselves still buy into this myth and they need to unlearn it. We need to unlearn it. It's a lie. Because we think if we get better educated and learn white cultural rules, we can be CEOs. If we stay out of the sun and stay as white-skinned as possible, even though we admire tans, we can blend in. If we celebrate our ancestral cultures for the entertainment of those who want to see our communities as entertainment and not real people, we can fit in. coupled with the surge of anti-Asian racism and violence, the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement was a wake-up call to Asian North Americans. There was obviously a need to disrupt the white ladder of proximity and stand with the Black community. And many of Asian groups are starting to build relationships with Black communities in their areas, and to realize that, yeah, we can't be so separate. Because comparison is division and based on white supremacy. When has binary and divisive thinking prevented you from seeing anti-Asian racism? When have you judged Asian experiences to be insignificant compared to anti-Black or anti-Indigenous racism? And what do you need to unlearn to become anti-racist? I commend to you a video. A news release that's just come out from NBC. It's the most comprehensive and powerful report that I've seen that gathers together histories of Asians in North America. It's America, US, but it's also Canada. It's called The Racism Virus, Anti-Asian Violence is Surging, and it is not letting up yet. So it has interviews with celebrities, with people who have made it, and yet their stories are that they haven't yet made it. They're individuals, and there needs to be a way to bring collective culture to a different place than it is. What am I doing for time? 2 more minutes. Okay. I want to share with you one story.
You're good, Kim. You don't need to rush. You don't need to rush.
I always feel like I have too much material and then I really need to cut it down. I want to share one story with you to talk about the intersections of race and gender and sexualization and a whole bunch of other things. So let me tell you one of my own stories. Years ago, I was involved in the early feminist movement because I'm so old. That brought me into contact with a woman who in the United Church who was supporting women's issues and supporting women's work. And we ended up having a disagreement that I remember to this day. I could still feel it in my blood boiling, because she insisted that it didn't matter what I looked like. I was a woman first. I was born a woman. I should align myself with women's issues because my race and my cultures did not matter. I'm going to take this down. And we argued about this for a really long time. It was getting ridiculous. Because white women in those days ruled the feminist movement. They didn't like to think they did, but they did. And she was well-meaning, but colorblind. I would say a colorblind liberal, which is one of the most difficult people to enter into an anti-racist understanding. So I maintained with her that even though my identity was female and Japanese Canadian, I couldn't say I'm only female. And she insisted I was born and identified female first, and race didn't have anything to do with my female identity. In other words, I was just like her, which is what she was trying to say, and trying to include me in this white feminist movement. Decades later, I would say that I have better language and a better understanding to counter the binary and racist arguments, and would say that I'm pretty sure that my XX chromosome and my uterus were not born before the rest of my body, even though I'm sure that's what she didn't mean. Because when you align people with the white supremacist culture, it denigrates and dismisses everything else except how close to whiteness you are. And binary divisive thinking is dangerous. And it's something that's so easy to do, particularly from a Western culture where either or culture is the norm. Whereas Asian cultures, particularly, but also Indigenous. So I want to end with that and have some more conversation. watch that video of the NBC report. It is 52 minutes, but it is very worthwhile if you can get through it without tearing up a bit. Canada Reads winner Mark Sekimoto, who's the author of Forgiveness, A Gift from My Grandparents, said this about his engagement in the justice work as a mixed race Japanese Canadian. He said, to look away from injustice is to betray our ancestors and their legacy. We can no longer look away. Racism looks like all of this, not one of these things, but all of this together. And that's the justice that I know CCS particularly is engaged in. It's like making this world a better place for everyone and not in comparison to white majority. And that the dismantling of white supremacy is part of our work as well. So thank you for letting me ramble on. I did look at one question that Bill Slade had sent in ahead of time. And his question was, what role should we as Christians and members of the United Church of Canada be taking in opposition to all of the things that he mentioned globally? And what is the church doing specifically about these cases? And what biblical references support these answers? So that's a big question. I would say that the United Church particularly, but also the Anglican Church, has made statements of concern and opposition and works ecumenically with global partners wherever possible. The World Council of Churches, the Christian Conference of Asia, the All Africa Conference of Africa Churches, especially when we don't have relationships with partner churches in regions affected by violence and racism. It's only together, as I said, around the community, it's only together we can make a difference in the world. So I talked about a little bit about the Japanese Canadian context. In order to achieve redress in 1988, the Japanese Canadian community didn't do this on their own. They couldn't do this on their own. They had partners from a wide range of groups. The Caribbean Association joined the group, rabbis joined, unions joined, a whole range of diverse groups said this is an important justice issue that we want to be part of and we want to stand with the Japanese Canadians. So it's only the collective voice and actions that can make something happen. And that's an important thing to remember, that we're not in this alone as one denomination. And racism in Canada's own government and policing must also be opposed ecumenically as well as secularly. Indigenous communities that are still without safe drinking water 6 years after being promised, gas pipelines that are still threatening Indigenous lands. Treaties are broken constantly in the name of economic fairness to East Coast lobster fishers, to the Caledonia real estate developers, and you name it. It can go on and on. Policing continues to regard Black bodies as suspicious and criminal. That's a huge problem. Racism has many definitions, but power and financial profit are also key to including in the racist dynamic. Who gains from racist structures? Who loses? Whose stories are told and from what perspective? Where is racism showing up in your churches? Look at that. Don't shy away from that. And for biblical perspectives, seek justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Micah tells it all. So does Matthew. Wherever you did one to the least of these, you are doing to me. Doing it with compassion, which is what the NBC video says. There needs to always be compassion, but also standing up for what's right on behalf of others. So I leave that with that. And Bill, I hope that answers your questions a little bit. Thank you.